Diane Newton King had everything: a husband, a son and a daughter, a large beautiful house on a picturesque plot in one of the best neighborhoods, and a brilliant career. But one day she received a letter, and her life, perfect at first glance, turned into a nightmare. Diane Newton King, 34 years old. A successful television host originally from Detroit, Michigan. Ambitious by nature, she left her hometown almost immediately after coming of age. She studied while simultaneously trying to break into television. She began her professional career as a TV reporter on a little-known channel. She moved constantly, working in different cities, including outside her home state. For example, in Denver and Grand Junction, Colorado. She often went on business trips. Many people noted the promising young journalist. She was beautiful and energetic. When necessary, she could be tough. When needed, she was polite and tactful, without that preventing her from obtaining information. People were happy to share with her and open up during professional meetings. In 1989, she received an offer from the editorial office of a television channel with a fairly high rating. They offered her a position in her home state, in the city of Battle Creek. Diane now hosted her own program, working closely with politicians and business leaders, which quickly made her a prominent figure across Michigan. At 34, she was married to 45-year-old Bradford King. In his early years, he served as a police officer, became a vice detective, earned a law degree, and transferred to the Major Crimes Investigation Unit. Diane encouraged Brad's professional growth, and he began consulting for journalists and writing articles for small circulation newspapers. Thanks to his wife's connections, Brad received several interesting job offers, and in the late 1980s, after leaving the police force, he began teaching criminology at Western Michigan University. Diane and Brad had a 3-year-old son, Marler. In 1990, a daughter was born, whom the couple named Kateri. Having finally achieved professional success, the Kings were able to afford a home in an upscale neighborhood. The family moved from a city townhouse to a spacious country house with a fireplace, located at the edge of a forest. On the property stood a large stable with a garage, a hayloft on the second floor, and a workshop. Not far from the house flowed a small river. The place was beautiful, secluded on one hand, yet not remote or wild. Neighboring affluent properties were located roughly 300 meters away. A road ran nearby, just a 5-minute drive, and the family was already in town. Perfect. However, in the second half of 1990, trouble began to haunt the Kings. Diane started being harassed by a deranged admirer. He called her at work and suggested they meet. He even insisted on a romantic trip together to Florida. Refusals did not deter him, and he continued calling with new proposals, sometimes several times a day. Everyone at Diane's workplace knew about it. She did not keep her worries to herself and informed her colleagues about the problem, including management. Even Mark Crawford, the company's vice president, was aware of the harassment and deeply sympathized with his employee. In November 1990, the phone rang in the King's house. Diane immediately sensed that something was wrong. Anxious, she slowly approached the phone and picked up the receiver. It was her secret admirer. Frightened, Diane slammed the phone down. This was the first time he had ever called her at home. That was when the television network security department became seriously alarmed. The issue was that the King's home phone number was kept in strict secrecy and could not be obtained through directory services or without the involvement of law enforcement. All media personalities in the country were afforded such protection. Her husband, closely connected to criminal investigations, harbored no illusions and fully understood how dangerous such calls could be. He hired 2 bodyguards for Diane, ready to accompany her around the clock. In early December 1990, an unknown person broke into the King's house while no one was home. Nothing was stolen, and the only damage was a shattered pane in the outer door. Still, the break-in caused a major stir. The police opened an investigation, but it led nowhere. After this incident, Diane could no longer find peace. She developed something close to paranoia. She suspected everyone, especially her male co-workers, since people at work knew her addresses and contact details. She began having nightmares, followed by insomnia. She constantly complained to her husband that someone was standing by the window, watching them. At night, she imagined dark, motionless silhouettes in the yard. It seemed to her that they were tracking her every movement and hearing every word she spoke. Brad became genuinely alarmed by his wife's condition. If security was not nearby, he always kept her within sight, meeting her after work and accompanying her to the television station in the mornings. Her husband also took additional security measures. He equipped the country house with a special landscape lighting system that was automatically activated by motion sensors in front of the house. If anyone attempted to approach the home after dark, the exterior lights would switch on automatically, while the house itself would be plunged into darkness. At the same moment, a loud alarm would sound, and from there, it would be Brad's responsibility. Upon spotting an intruder, Brad would immediately call the police. In theory, such a system made it possible to take emergency measures to protect the home in the event of any suspicious activity nearby. Relatives even lent the Kings their Doberman for a while, whose barking would also draw the owner's attention. Brad constantly checked all doors and windows whenever the family returned home, inspecting them especially carefully before going to bed. At least at home, Diane King now felt safe. Christmas came, and with it Diane received an unpleasant surprise. Someone placed an anonymous letter in the mailbox. Later, the police classified it as containing a potential threat. The letter consisted of the phrase, "You were supposed to have lunch with me," assembled from letters cut out of newspaper and magazine headlines and glued onto a sheet of paper. The letter was handed over to the police, who opened an investigation and then shelved the case indefinitely. After that, the situation improved. The calls stopped, and the journalist received no new letters. Diane even began going out alone. Before that, she had only left the house in the company of her husband or under the close watch of bodyguards. On the Saturday morning of February 9th, 1991, Brad King woke up alone. His wife had gone to visit her parents in Sterling Heights, Michigan, taking the children with her. She was supposed to return home within a couple of hours. Brad decided to pass the time and went for a walk in the forest, which often helped him clear his thoughts. When he returned, he discovered his wife's body on the area in front of the house. Diane was lying on her back near her car, inside which their children were sitting. Apparently, the woman had stepped out of her SUV to open the garage doors. That was when she was struck by a bullet. Even the initial examination of the body made it possible to conclude that Diane had been shot from some distance with a small caliber rifle. There were 2 shots. One entered the chest from above downward. The second traveled upward, with a wound channel from the pubic bone to the left clavicle. The medical examiner immediately suggested that the killer fired the first shot from an elevated position, and the second after approaching the fallen body. To hit in that way, the shooter would have had to hold the rifle very close to the ground. Why this was done was unclear at the time. The second shot was effectively a finishing or control shot. It was possible that after being hit by the first bullet, Diane was still alive. All of this happened in the presence of very young children. Based on the medical examiner's preliminary conclusions made at the crime scene, Sheriff John Olson, forensic specialists, and detectives began inspecting elevated positions that could have provided cover for the shooter. First and foremost, these were the treetops of the trees surrounding the house. Soon, the killer's hiding place was discovered. It turned out to be the hayloft in the stable located, as expected, on the second floor. Near the hayloft window, a .22 caliber shell casing was found in the hay. AK-9 handler, Gary Leisel, who was called to the scene with his German Shepherd Travis, attempted to track the shooter's escape route. Unexpectedly, the dog confidently picked up the scent and raced toward the small stream flowing near the house. There, a Remington 511 rifle was found, stuck barrel down into the streambed. 7.22 caliber shell casings were found on the bottom. Subsequent ballistic testing showed that all of these casings had been fired from the rifle found in the stream. In addition, the casing discovered in the hayloft was also, with high probability, fired from the same weapon. Gary Leisel's discoveries did not end there. Following the stream with Travis, the handler moved deeper into the forest and, after tracing an arc of approximately 1.5 kilometers, emerged back near the King's house. This suggested that the killer had run through the surrounding area, returned to the crime scene, and apparently observed the police activity from within the crowd of onlookers and television reporters. Investigators asked Brad whether he had heard anything, given that the killer had been so close to him. Brad replied that he had heard shots, quite a few of them. However, hunters frequently passed through the area, and he and his family had long grown accustomed to such sounds. This time, the target had been his wife. The murder of Diane King became the #1 sensation in Michigan for a time. The investigation, which initially began very actively, soon stalled. Forensic experts were unable to match the bullets recovered from the victim's body to the rifle that had been found. The bullets were too badly deformed. As potential suspects, investigators even considered men whom King had once interviewed. They also could not rule out the possibility that the killer was a viewer who had paid one of the television station's employees for Diane's phone number and address. The case grew increasingly complex. The investigation went nowhere for nearly 10 months, until finally the sheriff, after attending an FBI training seminar in Quantico, suggested that psychologists take another look at the anonymous letter Diane King had received. It was the only piece of evidence that might lead investigators to the deranged admirer. After examining the original letter, FBI specialists reached the following conclusion. The letter, composed of cut-out letters, represented the rarest type of anonymous message. Of all genuine criminal messages, such letters account for no more than 1%. Films often show scenes in which a criminal cuts letters out of printed publications. In real life, however, this is extremely rare. People resort to making such letters when their handwriting could be recognized by the recipient of the anonymous note. In that case, the victim might grow suspicious. If it had been an ordinary viewer who knew Diane only from television, there would have been no reason for him to conceal his handwriting so carefully. This meant that the person who sent the letter to Diane was someone she knew. She could, for example, have encountered him through her work. She might have seen his handwritten texts or working notes. The circle of suspects was narrowing. But who could it be? The absence of any forensically significant traces on the letter pointed to the maker's meticulousness and caution. The sloppy way the letters were glued on was nothing more than a deliberate attempt to mislead investigators. The author of the letter was trying to present himself as a disorganized, emotionally unstable person, but in reality he was not. All of this suggested that the letter's author had a solid understanding of police methods and forensic analysis of written communications, was cautious, and very cunning. The list of suspects narrowed down to a single individual, a criminology professor with practical police experience, Bradford King. The husband found himself at the very center of the investigation. Soon it would become clear that there had been no obsessed fan at all. It was the husband himself who had been calling and writing to his wife. Investigators had good reason to suspect that Brad, being an intelligent and resourceful criminologist, had prepared a kind of trap by which he intended either to confuse the investigation or make a guilty verdict impossible. These concerns were partly confirmed in March 1992, when a man renting a house next door to King's home reported finding a Remington 511 rifle in the attic. This rifle exactly matched the one used by the killer to shoot Diane King. It seemed logical to assume that the perpetrator had hidden this rifle in the vacant house immediately after the murder, and that the rifle found by the K9 handler in the stream had nothing to do with the crime and served merely as a decoy. Thus, investigators now had two identical rifles at their disposal. At the same time, the condition of the bullets was such that it was impossible to determine with absolute certainty which of the two rifles had fired them. But the rifle would, as they say, go off a little later. For now, let us return to the suspect. More precisely, to his professional activities. Brad King's university course was particularly notable for the assignment he gave his students at the very end of their studies. They were required to write a term paper proposing and justifying an original concept of the perfect murder. That is, a murder that would be fundamentally impossible to solve without a full confession. Investigators decided to find out whether the accused might have borrowed certain ideas from those papers. It turned out that in one term paper, a student, an aspiring criminologist, suggested simulating the victim being stalked by strange unknown individuals in order to confuse the investigation. In another paper, a student proposed that during the commission of a crime, the perpetrator should flee via water, either swimming or moving along the shoreline, and then return to the crime scene by tracing a wide arc through the area. It should be noted that this is a fairly commonplace method of evading pursuit, well known to border guards and special forces personnel. So there was nothing particularly original in that paper. Brad could have known this himself, but he clearly took it into account. Finally, in yet another creative paper, a student examined a method of planting two pieces of evidence, each of which could potentially be the murder weapon, but which, due to certain manipulations performed on them, could not be definitively proven as such. The student analyzed the legal collisions that arise from an overabundance of evidence. It is not hard to notice that the investigation into Diane King's murder contained elements of all the student works mentioned above. That is what the phone calls and letter were for, the break-in, and the two identical rifles. Although Brad claimed that he had never owned a .22 caliber rifle, two housekeepers testified in court that they had seen such a rifle under the bar counter in the kitchen of the King's townhouse, where they lived before moving to the country house. Brad could not have foreseen that the housekeepers would testify. During searches, police found a cleaning rod from a Remington 511 kit and an open box of .22 caliber ammunition. Admittedly, the ammunition was not of the same type as the casings found in the hayloft and the stream, but in this case, the mere fact that such ammunition was present in the house was significant. It was also established that all anonymous phone calls occurred only when the spouses were not together. Over 6 months, the stalker never once called when the couple was in the same place. How, then, did the wife not recognize her husband's voice? Even at that time, voice disguisers, voice changers, already existed. Kidnappers who later demanded ransom and knew they were being monitored often used such devices. They can alter a voice beyond recognition. Of course, an experienced criminologist would have been aware of such a trick and used it. It is even possible that he assembled one himself, having handled such devices more than once during his professional career. Diane might otherwise have recognized her husband by his manner of speaking or characteristic intonation. But Brad anticipated this. He spoke in short sentences, made long pauses, and slowed his speech. Guessing was impossible. Taken together, all of this suggests that the deranged professor had clearly been planning the crime for a long time, collecting ideas on how to kill his wife without becoming a suspect. He found those ideas in the coursework of his own students. One can only wonder what their reaction was when all of this came to light. Could Bradford King's motive really have been nothing more than tricking the investigation and proving to himself that he was capable of committing the perfect murder, that he was smarter than everyone else? In fact, the reason was far more mundane. It turned out that Brad was constantly cheating on his wife. One of his mistresses lived in Battle Creek and owned a beauty salon there. In addition, Brad had an ongoing affair with one of the university students. Beyond that, there were rumors that the professor regularly pressured female students in his course into intimate relationships. Brad also spent time in the men's club of a student fraternity, drinking and playing billiards for money with the students. Such behavior alone was reprehensible. But Brad went even further. He supplied prostitutes for student parties, using his old police connections to facilitate it. He did not treat Diane gently. He was harsh and could physically abuse her. At the trial before the jury, John Sims, Brad's lawyer, said, "I understand that after hearing details about Mr. King's life, you are unlikely to feel much sympathy for him. I doubt you like my client, but you cannot convict him simply for being a poor family man." And indeed that was true. So we continue. Brad had been living a double life for quite some time, and Diane King, of course, knew about it all, having her own sources of information. She tried to influence her husband, insisting that he take on more household responsibilities and spend less time in the student club. She asked him to at least work full-time. At the university, he worked no more than 4 hours a day. More than 80% of the family budget came from Diane's income, and she was entirely justified in demanding that Brad take on a heavier workload at the university. He refused, unwilling to change his playboy lifestyle. Then one day, Diane announced that she wanted to leave her job and focus solely on raising their young children. At that point, Brad would have no choice but to work more, since all the family's financial responsibilities would fall on him. And if he refused, Diane would leave him, and he would have to forget about the beautiful house and the comfortable lifestyle he had enjoyed. He could not allow that. If before this statement he had kept the idea of murdering his wife only in his fantasies, after her words all doubts vanished. The solution was obvious to him. Kill her, collect the insurance, hire a nanny for the children, and continue living as he had before. Inspired by the student's papers, he created the persona of a deranged admirer. Fully aware that his wife was a public figure and that there would be many potential suspects, he knew this would confuse the investigation. In the weeks leading up to the murder, he behaved like a caring and concerned husband. He took active measures to protect Diane. Using the 2 identical rifles, he fired 2 shots, most likely one from each, so that identifying the murder weapon would be extremely difficult. One shot was fired from the hayloft. Then he approached his wife. But why was the second shot fired in such a strange way? The rifle was held very low, practically at ground level. The reason was that Diane was supposed to leave the children with her parents. She had been hoping to reconcile with her husband. The couple had planned to spend the weekend alone together. But on the way to her parents' house, Diane's daughter became unwell, and Diane could not leave her behind. She returned home with the children. Brad had not anticipated this. Yet he had to act under the circumstances. He deliberately crouched low to the ground so that the children, sitting in the tall SUV, would not notice him. From this position, he fired the second shot. If the killer had been someone else, there would have been no need for such careful precautions. He planted one rifle in the neighboring house, left the other nearby, followed the stream, traced an arc, and returned to the house, to the body of his dead wife. He called the police. After nearly a year, Bradford was finally arrested for the murder. The former husband remained surprisingly calm and did not admit guilt. His defense team reasonably argued that all the evidence against him was circumstantial, and that a conviction based solely on it would be unjust. News of Bradford King's arrest sparked a flood of local press articles and numerous television reports. Despite the fact that the case rested on circumstantial evidence, Brad King was ultimately found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life imprisonment. Later, the juvenile court divided custody of the children between their maternal and paternal grandparents. Brad's plan had almost succeeded. He had indeed managed to confuse the investigation immediately. As we know, husbands and lovers are the first suspects when a woman is murdered or disappears. But Brad was not only unsuspected, he was not even questioned at the start of the investigation. He lived quietly for almost a year. And if not for that fateful letter, the criminology professor's masterclass would have been a complete success.